So, what is a case brief and how do we actually do one? Well, if you're headed into law school, I'm guessing you've heard the term case brief thrown around. And when we say case brief, what we mean is a way that we use to categorize and organize the information in a case. And so that begs the question, what in the world is a case? Well, in law school, the vast majority of what you're going to be assigned to read in your courses are going to be cases. And when we say cases, we mean written judicial opinions that are designed to resolve a dispute between two parties in a lawsuit. And so, as you can imagine, these written judicial opinions get very long, very complex, very convoluted. And so, case briefs are the best way that we have come up with to organize and categorize the information in these written judicial opinions so that we can actually understand it, we can follow it, and we can make sure that we are following along in a class lecture by our professor. So I created a video a couple years ago talking through how to create a case brief. But this year in 2025, there are some really important tweaks that I have implemented in the case brief creation process. So definitely make sure to stick around so we can walk through and I can show you what those are. And also stick around to the end so that you can hear what is the biggest mistake that I see new law students making when it comes to creating case briefs. So when we're talking about case briefs, there are 5 important parts of every case. And what those parts include are number 1, the facts. So who sued who for what in this lawsuit? The second piece is the issue. What is the legal issue that the parties are asking this judge to decide? The third piece is going to be the rule, which is actually a lot more convoluted and sort of difficult to describe than what it sounds. But essentially, what we're looking for is the biggest takeaway from the case, the thing that this case is known for as it pertains to the black letter law that it is developing. The fourth thing is going to be the reasoning/analysis. So the justifications that the judge is using to come to the conclusion that the judge came to. And the fifth part is the holding, which is the conclusion, the outcome that the judge ultimately came to in the case. So now let's go through the steps of actually creating a case brief so you can see me do it in real time. But before we do that, remember that reading these cases and creating these case briefs are only the first step in the 5-step study process of getting you ready for final exams, the thing you're actually graded on. So if you haven't yet, be sure to grab my free Beat the Curve guide so that you can see how case briefing fits in holistically with the rest of the steps to get you ready for those final exams in law school. And with that, guys, let's dive into these steps so you can see how they actually work. All right, so here we are to walk through the steps of actually creating a case brief. So over here on the right, we have our case, and this is the case of Garrett versus Daly. It's a very famous torts case that you are absolutely going to read your 1L year in your torts class. And it's a pretty short case. It is about, 3.5 pages long. And when we are building our case brief, the very first step is we need to decide where we're actually going to build this thing out. So, in other words, what note-taking software are we going to use? So, the 3 most popular types of note-taking software, I would say, are Google Docs, Microsoft Word, and Microsoft OneNote. When I was in law school as a 1L, I really loved Microsoft OneNote, but I have since become a convert to Google Docs because of how simple, how easy, how centralized you can keep everything, and also because of this tab feature over here that get used in other steps of the study process. So if you are on the fence, any one of those will do, but Google Docs is my favorite. Okay, great. So once you have chosen where you're actually going to take notes on the cases that you read, in other words, your case brief, we are next going to actually build out our case brief. And so what I like to do is do what I call creating a case brief template. And all that means is that you are going to create your headings that you can just copy and paste over and over and over for all of the cases that you're assigned in all of your classes. And so what we're looking for is the case name and then the court and year. Not because you actually need to know or memorize the court and the year, but because it's just nice to have an understanding of what court the case is coming out of and what year it was published. And so in this example, Our case name is Garrett versus Daly. The court it's coming out of is the Supreme Court of Washington, and the year it was published was 1955. Excellent. Now, continuing to build out our case brief, remember we had those 5 main categories of information. So, the 5 main topics that we are going to use to categorize and organize the information in a case as we read it. And those 5 categories are the facts, the issue, the rule, the analysis slash reasoning, and the holding. That's it. Those are the 5 main ones. Those are the ones that we want in our case brief template. And yes, it is an excellent idea to keep it this simplified, this clean. We don't need to get fancy with it. We don't need to create weird formatting for it. This is all we need for our case brief template. Now, if it's helpful for you to have in your case brief template what the explanation of each of these categories is, you definitely can include that. So remember, the facts is who sued who for what. So what were the events that led up to the plaintiff suing the defendant? The issue is what is the legal issue that the parties are asking this judge to decide. The rule is also known as black letter law. So it's the legal rule of a case, but sometimes that's not nearly as straightforward as it seems, because the quote unquote rule can also be the judge sort of giving a definition of a term. It can also be the judge coming up with a factor test as a way to determine if a rule of law has been met. So the way that I like to think of rule is kind of generically as the big takeaway from the case. The reason why your professor is having you read this case, which I know is not the most descriptive, sort of clean way to describe it, but the rule can be a bit fluid. And so we're looking for the big takeaway, the reason why your professor is making you read this case in the first place. Analysis slash reasoning are the justifications, the reasons, the explanations for why the judge decided the case the way that he or she did. And the holding is the decision, the outcome, the conclusion of the case. So now that we have our case brief template created, which again, we can just literally copy and paste for every single case that we are assigned to read for any given class, all on the same page, just like that, going all the way down. But now that we have our case brief template created, what we would assume is the next logical step is we would start to read this case, right? So we can fill in the language from the case into these categories. What were the facts? What is the issue, the rule, the analysis slash reasoning, and the holding, right? That being said, if you can sort of imagine this, the idea behind a case is that we are trying to understand what the different pieces and parts of the case are so that we can organize them in a usable way. And the hardest way to go about doing that is reading a case cold. Just straight up line 1, word 1, just starting to read a case cold. What is infinitely more effective is having someone explain the case to you in these parts so that you don't have to waste hours and hours and hours trying to reverse engineer what these different parts of the case are. The reason for that is because judges do not write these cases, these judicial opinions, with law students in mind, right? They're not writing them for us. They're writing them for the litigants. They're writing them for the parties to explain their reasoning. And judges are not always clear. They do not always, not only always, rarely are they clear. Rarely are they ever breaking these different pieces and parts into just a nice structure that is easy to follow, easy to understand. And so rather than spend hours and hours and hours trying to dig through the case and find and pick out language that sort of kind of fits into these categories. What I would very strongly recommend before you actually sit down to read the case is to have a resource explain these big takeaways from the case to you so that you have a GPS for what in the world you're even looking for when you read this. So, my favorite case resource is known as Quimby. And Quimby is a paid resource that you can sign up for and have a monthly subscription to, but they also have a free 7-day trial. So you can just try it out and see what you think, see if you like it. And the two main things that Quimby is best at, in my opinion, is for every case, I shouldn't say for every case. For most of the 1L cases that you'll be assigned, they have a video, like a animated video where they talk through what the case is about, what the facts are, and they make it very easy to understand, sort of explain it to me like I'm 5, which is exactly what we want. And then underneath, they have some language for a very basic case brief. So what I think Quimby does the best are these videos. These explanatory videos that are in a very easy to understand animated
The
framework
incident leading to
because these cases can get really confusing, really convoluted. The actual physical written case brief below it, I think they don't do as well, but the case brief video, 100% recommend. So I would actually, as our next step, recommend that you watch that video. And as you do, take notes on the video in these different sections. So the facts of the case, the issue, the rule, the analysis/reasoning, and the holding. So let me show you an example of what a case brief for Garrett versus Daly could look like. And the blue is the language, the explanation from the case where all of these different pieces tend to fit, right? So the facts of what happened, what was the lawsuit that led to this case? What is the issue that the court was asked to decide? What was the rule, the big takeaway from the case that we are even reading this case in the first place to understand? What were the reasons, the explanations that the court gave for coming to this conclusion? And then what, in fact, was the conclusion of the court? So once we have taken notes on the Quimby case video, only then would I actually recommend starting to read the case. The reason for that, as we talked about before, is as we read through the case, now we know what we're looking for. We have at least a C+ understanding of what in the world this case is about, why it's in our case book, what we're supposed to be getting from it, and then all of these additional details and verbiage and legalese and sort of confusing one-offs and thought patterns of the court don't feel nearly as confusing and complex because we can always come back to our GPS of what the big important pieces of the case are here. And so as you read through the case, you can absolutely feel free to add in additional facts, additional reasoning/analysis, additional explanation of the holding of the court. You can feel free to add in details. But just keep in mind, it is very normal and natural, especially when you're just starting out reading cases, to feel this need to basically copy and paste all of the language of the case into one of these categories. That is totally fine. We all do it. And then the more and more and more that you read cases, the more and more that you watch these case videos for different cases, you'll start to get a sense for what are the things that your professor thinks are important, what is sort of like the language that indicates to you when facts are being talked about, when rule language is being talked about, when reasoning is being talked about, when holding is being talked about. And your case briefs will start to get more and more dialed in as you go. One thing, though, to be aware of as we go through this, and this is the biggest mistake that all of us as 1Ls make, is that we over allocate time to this step of the study process, this reading note step, this case brief step, whatever you want to call it, pre-class work. And we do that because of one, how confusing these cases are, but two, out of fear of being cold called on in class, right? Out of fear of our professor asking us a very detailed question about something in the case that we happen to not take notes on. And so, what we tend to do, at least in my experience, is we tend to rewrite or copy paste every single line of the case into one of these categories, right? Out of an abundance of caution to have everything in our case briefs. Now, let yourself do that for the first few weeks of the semester. Again, that's totally normal and natural. But as quickly as we can, to go through as we're reading the case and resist the temptation to add additional notes into our case briefs. The reason why we want to reduce that sort of temptation and that default urge to do that is because it is not actually relevant what we take from the case. What actually matters and what's actually relevant and what we'll actually use on final exams is what our professor thinks is relevant from the case. And the only way that we're going to know that is to go to class and take amazing class notes. And so, because what our professor thinks is relevant is what we actually care about, what we don't want to do is invest hundreds and thousands of hours into essentially rewriting cases into our case brief template, only to, if we had waited 24 hours, take the class notes that our professor is saying out loud, and then we would know what our professor wants us to know from the case. So keep that in the back of your mind. That is the transition we are working on as quickly as you feel comfortable doing it once classes start, so that we can sort of make sure we don't fall into the trap of spending 99% of our time on this reading note step, and we can actually move forward and reallocate that time into the study step pieces of the process that actually move the needle for us, that actually help us understand the information we need to do well on the final exam. All right, guys, I hope that was really helpful, sort of demystifying the case brief creation process. So now you know what they look like, how to do them. But again, remember that these are only the first step in the 5-step study process. If you haven't yet, definitely grab my free Beat the Curve guide so you can see what those other steps are and how they all fit together to get you ready for the thing you're actually graded on in law school, which are your final exams. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments below, and I will see y'all in the next video.